But then we were back this last summer, we're in August for 3 weeks. And today we'll be talking about some of the militarization issues, really just focusing on what we think people from the United States needs to know about our involvement, how our actions here impact Colombia. Obviously there's many, many more topics we could focus on, but today it'll be more about how our tax dollars are being used in Colombia, and also about this kind of, I call it an emerging issue of palm oil and how our use of palm oil is impacting countries around the world, including Colombia and the people of Colombia. So this first slide says that Colombia is a country that's rich in resources. You'll see it's a beautiful slide taken in the gold mining region of Colombia. Colombia is suspected to have the most gold mine deposits left in South America. So it's become a country of great interest around the world. And of course, Colombia is concerned that it'll be the multinationals, it'll be the Anglo Gold Ashantis from South Africa, from England, that will take the resources and that gold. And there's a lot of interest in this part of the world right now. Along with gold, they also have reserves of coal, oil, emeralds, but it's also really fertile land for growing coffee, cocoa, bananas, cut flowers, palm oil. It's also, you're probably maybe familiar with the free trade agreement working its way through Congress right now. We're opposed to the way the current free trade agreement is written, but it's based on just fertile lands for bananas, for palm oil, cut flowers. It's really important to understand the roots of the Colombian conflict. It's about the unequal distribution of land and resources. In this country, more recently, we hear about the Colombian conflict as if it's a war on drugs and if it's a problem of drugs. And we're going to talk a little more about the history of the conflict, but just this unequal distribution of these resources of the land has led to over 50 years of conflict in Colombia. And I have a quote here from a professor from Colombia, and he says, just in 2009, he said, "The distribution of land property is not only dramatically unequal, but also unstable, and the present situation is as difficult to solve as ever." So again, just stressing that it's the distribution of land and resources that's led to the conflict, and that perpetuates the conflict. 50 years of armed conflict in Colombia, like I mentioned, the guerrilla groups, those are the groups you hear about probably the most in the news, the FARC, the ELN. They formed in the 1950s and 1960s in a struggle for equal distribution of land, and this was an armed struggle where the poorer people of Colombia said, wait a minute, all the rich people have the land, the resources, this is unfair, and they rose up in an armed struggle. Later, to protect themselves from the guerrilla, the wealthy landowners and drug dealers started to create private armies, and those are the groups we know of as the paramilitaries. It's really important to remember that both the guerrilla groups and the paramilitaries, these are illegal armed groups, and in the simplest way of looking at the conflict, the guerrilla groups are fighting on the left, and the paramilitaries are fighting on the right side of the conflict. Neglect of rural areas by the government means the military is often the only visible government presence, which leads to mistrust of government. So you see here we're traveling again, this is the gold mining region, really undeveloped roads. This ties in, we weren't going to talk a lot about the free trade agreement today, but just because it's going through Congress, important to note. You can see here how the farmers that live in this region, they're going to have a hard time participating in a free trade agreement where they're given incentives for bringing cut flowers to market. There's incentives for tropical fruits. These farmers are not going to be able to participate on any sort of level playing field under that free trade agreement. And it means that in these areas, what the people are saying to us is that they don't want the military. They don't want to see the military as the main way that their government is caring for them. What they'd like is a road. What they'd like is schools. They'd like health clinics. That's the presence they'd like to see of their government. Can't talk about the conflict without mentioning drugs, just because, again, more recently, and certainly under the Bush administration, that the war on drugs became how we understand the conflict in this country. So it's really important to understand that the cocaine trade, the illegal drug trade, didn't begin in Colombia until the 1970s. So coca has been grown in Colombia as a medicinal drug. It's still used medicinally. People will take it, make teas and things for colds and coughs. maybe just have a few plants on their backyard, like we might have an aloe plant or something. But in terms of growing it for illegal drug trade, that didn't happen until the 70s, so about 40 years ago. And as I mentioned, the conflict started almost 60 years ago. So if we think that we can solve the conflict by going at it with the drug trade, and what many people would say is that the drug trade fuels the conflict. It's supplying the income for the guerrilla groups, for the paramilitary groups. At this point, it's providing lots of the income, but it's not the root cause of the conflict. And until we address the root cause, which is this unequal distribution of land and resources, these illegal groups will find other sources of income, and they already do. There's an illegal oil trade in Colombia as well. So if we take drugs out of the equation, they'll find another way to fuel the conflict. Today we are going to talk then about two of these issues that I mentioned in kind of the introductory remarks. One is the continued militarization of Colombia by the United States, and Mills will talk about how we're spending more of our tax dollars now in Colombia with the militarization. And then we're going to look at an issue of a community that's been displaced from their land, actually, for the production of palm oil. And then, fortunately, some good news that they're back on their land. And every time we give this presentation, we get to give an update, which has actually been a lot of good news for this community. But it's still important to kind of understand the history of this community that was displaced.
And the economic realities that affect the community and that continue to affect. So one of the things that's important for us as U.S. citizens to recognize is that we give a lot of money to the Colombian government, mostly for military aid. We've given over $5 billion, I believe, to Colombia since 2000, and the majority of that has been military aid. Colombia is the third biggest foreign aid recipient of the United States after Israel and Egypt. So we have a lot of investment in Colombia, and a lot of that aid, 60 or 70 or 80%, depending on the year, is going to military and police aid. This year we'll give over $351 million to Colombia for military and police aid. I think there's a lot of concerns about the Colombian military and about the way we're giving this aid to Colombia. We're not placing a lot of restrictions on how they use it, and there's a lot of concerns about how they are using it. One really serious concern are what are called extrajudicial executions. Between 2002 and March of 2010, there were over 1,300 reported extrajudicial executions. This is when the military stops someone, the military kills someone outside of combat. I guess maybe that's the simplest definition. It's where they stop someone, maybe this is a person who has been accused of being a member of the guerrillas, but instead of taking them into custody, taking them to, putting them on trial, sentencing them to prison or something like that for participating in rebellion, the military just kills them. Sometimes it's not even somebody who's been accused of being a guerrilla, or there's not a legitimate accusation of them being a guerrilla. Sometimes what happens is the soldiers are out in a very rural area, very remote area. There's not very much oversight. They've been there for a long time. They're sick of being out in the jungle, sleeping in a tent, and they know that there are incentives for being able to show progress in the war against the guerrilla. If they kill a guerrilla fighter, they may qualify for a leave to go home and see their family. They may qualify for a promotion. They may get a financial incentive from the military, a bonus for every guerrilla fighter that they kill. And so they might be out there in the rural areas and they decide, okay, I'm going to kill somebody, dress them up in a guerrilla uniform, and claim that they were a guerrilla fighter killed in combat. And so again and again, we met with families who said, my son, my husband was killed by the military. He wasn't a guerrilla, but they claimed he was, and they took credit for kind of a military victory by killing him. There was a highly publicized case in 2008. There were a group of young men from Soacha. It's a very poor suburb outside of Bogota. They were unemployed. and somebody came and offered them a job. They came home to their families and says, oh, I have really good news. I have this job offer. I'm going to have to, they're taking me someplace else, so I'm going to go away for a few weeks, but I'll be back and I have this work. So the families were happy. The men went away, and 2 weeks later, there was several hundred miles outside of Bogota in a rural area, the military announced this big victory over the guerrillas, and they turned over all these bodies of so-called guerrilla fighters who had been killed. Well, these so-called guerrilla fighters were quickly identified as these young men who had been offered jobs. And the parents were easily able to say, well, my son wasn't a guerrilla fighter until last week. He was, working, he was living here in Bogota. He was unemployed. He wasn't out in the jungle fighting. And it quickly became apparent that this was a complete frame-up. And there were 25 military officers who had been dismissed from the military. Some of them are standing trial for these extrajudicial executions. But the reality is that this is the kind of thing that happens all the time, and that most of the time, it's instead of poor men from the city who have, kind of family who can vouch for them, it's people from very rural areas who the investigations aren't even happening because the investigative bodies of the government aren't willing to go out to these rural areas. They feel like it's too dangerous. They feel like there's too much guerrilla presence or whatever. And so these deaths happen. The families say, well, my son wasn't a guerrilla, but nobody's looking into it. Nobody's holding the military accountable. Also, just in January of 2010, there was a mass grave that was discovered next to the Macarena Army Base. There were over 400 bodies. Some people have said perhaps as many as 2,000 bodies. They don't know yet how many bodies are in that grave. But the government says, oh, well, those were... The military, at some point said, oh, well, those were all guerrilla fighters. But, the policy for them, if they kill guerrilla fighters, shouldn't be to bury them in a hidden grave, unmarked grave. It should be to, bring the bodies, identify them, let their families know. And so clearly there's something going on here that's not legitimate. So as we look at what's going on in Colombia, one of the things that happened is in 2000, President Correa of Ecuador campaigned on a pledge to not renew the lease that Ecuador had with the United States to grant them access to the Manta Air Base in Ecuador. And so that agreement ended in 2009. As the United States looked for another place to have their military bases in South America, Colombia was kind of the best option. And so President Uribe of Colombia signed an agreement. Actually, the agreement he signed was with President Obama to allow the U.S. free entry to 7 Colombian military bases. So we went from having 1 military base in Manta to having 7 military bases in Colombia. Here are the 7 bases. One of the interesting things, we were looking at some documents written by the Air Force, and one of their comments is that limited restrictions on U.S. freedom of action by partner nations is a requirement of their base development program. So basically they're saying they only want to develop new military bases in countries where that country isn't going to place any limits on what they can do with that air base. And so this agreement really gives the U.S. broad authority to use these military bases for kind of whatever they want. The U.S. has appropriated $43 million to make improvements in the Palenquero Air Base. I think largely that's to build there's a number of things that they're doing, but largely that's to allow them to land big transport planes at the Palenquero Air Base that can then take off and travel to almost anywhere in South America. They can reach 90% of South America from there without having to refuel. So I think one of the concerns is we're using this as kind of to extend our military power throughout Latin America. When we were there just this last August, we were privileged to be able to join with about 3,000 other people who gathered outside the Palenquero Air Base to protest the increased militarization of Colombia. So this is something that's unpopular with the Colombian people as well. just the fact that you gather 3,000 people in Colombia, that's a pretty remarkable feat, just because in Colombia there's been so much violence, there have been so many people who have been killed for expressing political views, that to get those people together really shows a level of commitment, being willing to take some level of risk in order to participate in this protest. So, 3,000 people for a protest in the United States maybe doesn't seem like a huge protest, but for Colombia that was a really big deal. Because people really do feel like they're taking a risk. There are many valiant people who are speaking out against U.S. militarization in Colombia. There's a senator, Gloria Inés Ramirez, who was there at the rally, and she spoke. And one of the things she was saying is just how can the country with the most drug consumption tell us what to do about drugs? So they're really saying, she's really saying, if we want to address the issue of drug trafficking, we need to address it on the consumption side. We need to address it here, rather than trying to use the drug war as a justification for increasing the militarization in Colombia.
You talked about the Colombian military. So there's the guerrillas, there's the paramilitary, and then there's the military.
Right.
And when you're saying military, you're not talking about paramilitary group, correct?
Right. In the past, the military and the paramilitaries often worked very closely together, and that officially they were separate, but in reality that they often were coordinating their efforts, and so the paramilitaries were often being used to carry out the dirty work of the military.
And now the military do it alone.
Well, I think one of the things that's happened is that in 2006 there was a demobilization. Officially, the paramilitary groups turned in their weapons and are now civilians. Now, in reality, I think what happens is that they turned over some of their military structure, but they still were very involved in drug trafficking and other illegal activities. And so I think those activities continue, and there still is sort of a paramilitary structure. It's less tied to the work of the military now than it was. But the paramilitaries haven't really just demobilized, but there's less coordination between them and the military now than there used to be.
And again, in kind of simplest terms, the military and the paramilitary are on the same side of the conflict.
They're fighting against the guerrillas. Yeah.
That's a follow-up question, really. The paramilitary is also illegal.
Correct.
Right. Exactly.
But nothing is being done to crack down on paramilitary?
Well, I think things are being done to crack down on attempts are being made to crack down on illegal drug trafficking and those kinds of things. The government says that they are trying to, that they have tried to get rid of the paramilitary organizations, the paramilitary structures. The official line of the government is the paramilitaries don't exist anymore. That there was a demobilization in 2006, and now there are no more paramilitaries. The actual reality is that the paramilitaries do exist. They have different names now, or different, a little bit different structure.
2006. It was called the Justice and Peace Law, and that's when the government and the paramilitaries made this agreement that the paramilitaries would demobilize. And paramilitaries were given incentives for turning a gun in, and you were given cash incentives, you were given housing stipends, education stipends to say, okay, I'm leaving the paramilitary, here's my weapon. Well, there's several things that happen. One is certainly people we know that are on the other side of the conflict, so to speak, the left side, they would criticize that because to call it a justice and peace law and to say that you've made peace with a group of people that actually were never your enemy, really, is kind of a false concept there. The military and the paramilitary are on the same side of the conflict, and
They
then
were
they
working
say,
together, coordinating their efforts.
we've worked to make peace. I mean, who they need to make peace with are the guerrillas.
And there's never been a similar peace option offered to the guerrilla groups to say, if you turn in your weapons and say you're not going to fight anymore, we'll give you a stipend, we'll provide you with education, we'll give you housing, that kind of stuff.
And it was called the Justice and Peace Law, and there was no justice in that there was no reparations for victims. And so You have paramilitary fighters who've turned in a weapon, are given a housing stipend, and they're now living in a small community where there is a widow whose husband was killed by the paramilitary.
And whose land perhaps was taken by the paramilitary. This large landowner still owns her land, and she's not receiving any benefits.
Right. And then just the numbers prior to the Justice and Peace Law, they had estimated the number of paramilitaries that would turn in weapons. Well, the number was far greater than what was estimated, and only just raising suspicion for a lot of people. If they had a gun in their closet or a gun out in the shed, well, they brought that gun in, and I'm no longer a paramilitary. Some, walked out the back door with their stipend and came in the front door with another weapon.
Or people were joining the paramilitaries in order to be able to demobilize and qualify for these benefits.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. How do the police fit into this, and is there a centralization of the police forces, or are they all local?
Interesting question. Well, yeah,
sometimes the military and police are working against each other.
Yeah.
Well, in the rural areas, you just see much more of a military presence than a police presence. In the neighborhood we lived in, although we show a lot of rural slides, we actually lived in a city, but did a lot of rural travel. We lived in a city of a couple 100,000 people called Barranca Bermeja. And in the part of the city we lived in, it's interesting that the paramilitaries were actually in control of that part of the city. And I think the best way to think about it is they kind of operated like the mafia. I mean, they were in charge of the crime in our neighborhood, which means they don't want purses stolen, they don't want homes broken into, because this is where they live, this is where they're in charge. And so, but what they're in charge of, and they're also interested in much bigger money. They don't want your purse. They want, 500 barrels of gasoline from the pipeline. So we actually lived in a very safe neighborhood, but we had one incident happen where there was a young man who had broken into somebody's home, and we got a call saying that the paramilitaries had arrived at his house and had taken him away. And this was obviously of great concern to people. That he ended up fortunate because he lived, in that the paramilitary just said, threatened him and said don't do it again, and he was lucky to be brought home. But a more likely scenario would have been that he might have been killed for having committed a crime in that neighborhood. And it's just an example of, first of all, when you don't have a police presence, and an illegal group kind of fills that vacuum. As much as some people in the neighborhood actually would feel pretty supportive of what was happening because they live in a very safe neighborhood. We don't want illegal groups, doing our policing. And I think certainly in our neighborhood, a lot of people asking, where are the police? Why is there this vacuum that the paramilitaries are kind of in charge of our neighborhood?
Can you give a description of some of the actions of the FARC? And are they not the group that holds lots of hostages or whatever?
Yep, and certainly more in the 80s, particularly the guerrilla groups were using kidnapping as a way to make money. The
80s and the 90s.
That technique lost them a lot of favor around the world by especially communist governments that used to support the FARC. As they started kidnapping people, they lost a lot of favor, and really they're generally not using that technique now for kidnapping.
The hostages that they do hold now are mostly police officers or members of the military who they've captured, and they do hold those people for ransom and are trying to get money back for them. I think they've had some big setbacks too, in that some of their biggest name hostages were rescued a couple of years ago. Ingrid Betancourt, who was a presidential candidate, and there were 3 U.S. defense contractors that they held.
Our personal experience would be much more that in the rural areas where we were working and doing this accompaniment work, it is the Colombian military that were more a threat to the people that we were working with. And do you want to say more about, you had a little more interaction?
Well, I would say, yeah, in some parts of the country, in the part that we were working in, the biggest threat to the civilian communities was the military. In other parts of the country, I did some work in southern Colombia, in Nariño, with indigenous communities, and there by far the biggest threat to them was the FARC. And, the FARC was just really, any leaders who were, kind of stepping forward in the community, the FARC would say, you better not come into our territory or you will, we'll kill you, because we want to be the only leaders in this area. We want to be the only ones in control. And so, it's interesting because they're very fragmented right now. They aren't able to communicate very well from one part of the country to another, and so the role that they play is very different in different parts of the country. But in many parts of the country, they're very, very violent and very, very dangerous as well.
And some of the rural people we met, just their concern is that Colombia has gotten more safe for people, especially in the cities. Bogota is safe. I mean, their crime would be the same crime you would be concerned about in New York or Paris or any other major city. And so that violent crime has gone down in the cities, but it's the rural people that still feel a lot of pressure from whether it's the military, whether it's the FARC. And their concern is that the international community is sort of forgetting about that. I've read several news stories talking about, go back to Colombia, it's safe to travel in Colombia again. And it's true, you can go to the Caribbean, it's beautiful to visit there, but there are still these rural communities facing a lot of violence, also both the physical violence and also the pressure to leave their land to allow others to get those resources.
And I think that's an important thing to say. Colombia is a huge country. You saw some of our pictures of really rural areas. That there's very little infrastructure in terms of roads, bridges, transportation to a lot of these rural areas. So even though the government holds control over the big cities, over the highways, that there are huge swaths of the country that basically have no government control. And so that's where the guerrilla groups have come in. And the guerrilla groups still, are the de facto power in much of the country. There's a question over here too.
Well, I just wondered what the official drug policy was of Colombia. I mean, is there like a policy to try to eliminate illegal drugs?
There is a policy to try and eliminate illegal drugs. And, actually, it's interesting. The Colombian government's policy is one of manual eradication. They send out groups to go out to areas where people are growing coca and pull up the plants. The U.S. government has been trying to foster this policy of aerial spraying. They send planes out to spray very strong herbicides that are so strong they're not legal in the United States to use, but they spray them over these fields to kill the coca plants.
In Colombia.
In Colombia. That policy is very unpopular with the Colombian people, but the United States, because we are giving the money to this program and we have a lot of power in Colombia, are continuing to carry out this policy, even though it's been shown to be ineffective. I mean, that over the past 10 years that we've been doing the aerial spraying, the amount of coca production from Colombia has actually increased.
And that's according to U.S. State Department numbers.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, that would be another adult ed, but I did a tour with some farmers who had their land fumigated, and you can imagine the fear of these farmers that their land is going to be fumigated, and not as much their land, but that their children, their water, and one farmer talked about, he would hear the plane come in, and he had this white flag, and he just ran through his land waving this white flag, and our government would say, well, yeah, but we're not going to spray on his land. But can you imagine in your own home, even if it was 3 blocks away, a fumigation plane coming over, and would you ever feel safe about your children in your backyard, or knowing that herbicide is being sprayed through the air? The other one, we do want to talk about these land use issues. I think the conflict, as it's getting less violent in many parts of the country, one way the violence is changing really is what we would call economic violence. It's pressure to leave your land, and if you have no livelihood, even if it's obviously just difficult to have much quality of life without a way to make a living. So rural residents continue to be pressured to leave or sell their land. And this is, again, just because mostly multinationals that want to come in and get that land. In 2008, there was a community called Las Pavas, which invited Christian peacemaker teams, the organization we volunteer with. They invited Christian peacemaker teams to accompany them because of this pressure they were feeling to leave their land. Here you can see this is oil palm trees that are being grown on the side of this road. And we noticed just in the few years we were in Colombia, the amount of land that's being turned over to the production of palm oil. And certainly a lot of farmers also concerned about the monoculture. And we hear that in this country too. Farmers have a lot of wisdom about soil and land use. And as they see whole swaths of land, whole areas, we traveled a lot by rivers, and you'd go down a river and just all you could see is palm oil. So concern of the people there, the way I think the slides will kind of take us through this case of Las Pavas. In 1997, 123 families began farming this land that had been abandoned. That is a completely legitimate thing to do in Colombia in terms of land. They haven't had historically a land titling system, so there's vacant land that somebody hasn't used, hasn't been to. It is fine for you to go and start farming that. If you're farming that land or building a house on it or whatever, and the owner doesn't reappear, depending on, there's a lot of intricacies to the law, but generally it's between 5 to 10 years. If that landowner doesn't reappear, you actually become the rightful owner of that land. And again, based on the land distribution issues, here's farmers, they need land. Here's this land that no owner has done anything to in years. In terms of that redistribution of land, they feel like they need to take that and begin farming. So they begin that in 1997. In 2003, the paramilitaries forced the farmers from their land. And this, I don't know all the details, generally what happens. It's about territory, it's about who's controlling what, and at that point the paramilitaries wanted that particular land. The civilians were kind of a nuisance to them. So they forced the civilians to leave. But then in 2006, we mentioned the demobilization. The paramilitaries demobilized, weren't maintaining the same presence in the community. The community felt safe to return to that land. They returned. But then in 2007, a Colombian company called the Labrador Consortium purchased the land from Jesus Escobar Fernandez. And we say purchased in quotes there because under Colombian law, he doesn't own the land anymore. He used to own the land, but these people have been farming it for 10 years. He hasn't reappeared, but on paper.
He purchased it a long time ago and then never returned, never visited the land, never had anything to do with it.
Right. So the Labrador Consortium buys the land. And then this Labrador Consortium in 2009 starts clearing the land for the production of palm oil. And part of the Labrador Consortium is a group called Dabón. They're the largest producer of organic palm oil in Colombia. And because they're organic, because they're family owned, they get a lot of support in this country, and including the Body Shop, which some of you may know, selling cosmetics and lotions and all that in Rosedale and the Mall of America. The Body Shop was actually one of their purchasers of this palm oil from Dabón. And there was international pressure actually put on the Body Shop. They're based out of the United Kingdom. There was an international campaign telling them they should not be purchasing their palm oil from Dabón. Eventually, actually, that campaign paid off, and Dabón Body Shop actually agreed to cut ties with Dabón. I think there was mixed feelings maybe about that from those of us that wanted them to stop purchasing the palm oil from Dabón. On the other hand, what we really wanted was Body Shop to pressure Dabón to give this land back to these people. And it's kind of a mixed result. If the Body Shop that had a lot of ability to put pressure on Dabón, when they actually just pulled out, you also lose that pressure they could have put on Dabón. But on the other hand, a victory that they recognized, and that Dabón certainly got poor publicity when the Body Shop said they would no longer purchase the palm oil. Just want to briefly touch on this issue of palm oil. You're going to see more and more palm oil in the foods that you're buying. Because in 2006, since 2006, trans fats have to be listed on the back of on products that we're eating. And so as there's concern about trans fats and what that does to our health and our hearts, companies are replacing the trans fats with palm oil, which is seen as a better product in terms of our health, but still not a great product for us to be eating. And so there's all over the world, not all over the world, but in certain countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Colombia, people being really pressured to turn their land into palm oil. And it's interesting, I was watching a video on a woman from Indonesia talking about palm oil, and I've heard a Colombian farmer say, I mean, it was the same speech, and here she is in Indonesia, and here I've heard the same thing from a Colombian farmer. They're concerned about the fact that they're no longer growing food crops, they're growing a crop for export, that it's ecologically, environmentally, they have the same concerns about the way it's produced, this clear cutting that's happening, it's grown in kind of swampland that's really damaging the ecosystem around it, but it was, again, just striking that these two people, and I just have a lot of respect for people that have farmed the land for generations and generations, and they're giving the call out to say this is dangerous, what we're doing environmentally, but also to our people. And we knew Colombian farmers who were saying, now we're buying our rice somewhere, we're going to buy our corn, and I think that's like an Iowa farmer that would have to go buy corn somewhere or import their beef. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And in Colombia, when farmers, one thing they've always had is food to feed their family. You could go out in your backyard and at least pick some fruit, have some rice to feed your family, even in the leanest times. Well, if your crops are now all palm oil, even in the lean times, there's nothing to feed your family. Just a little bit of an aside, but the palm oil, it is threatening the extinction of orangutans in Asia, and it's cutting down rainforests to grow oil palm. By a lot of people's estimation, it's not a green substitute for gasoline. It's being promoted as a green fuel, but if we think about starting to grow palm oil in Colombia, process it there, ship it over here, I mean, we can, I think, just see how that might not seem like a green solution to our oil problems. But there are some signs of hope in what's happening with palm oil. One is that there's this group, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. It was created in 2004, and it's setting global standards on how palm oil is produced. So far, their standards are much more about the environment, and we would certainly like to see them also about human rights, because they're not really addressing the issues of the Colombian farmers that were displaced from their land, for example. They're more looking at whether it's sustainably produced in terms of the environment. But at least there is now an oversight group looking at these issues. Another reason we say mixed results is Gabon is actually a member of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So there's always just this question of how does this international roundtable, how do they really have any oversight on what a Colombian palm oil company is doing in rural Colombia, and how much can they really police that? General Mills announced in September 2010 that it's only going to use environmentally responsible palm oil by 2015. Cargill, I think, is one of the bigger purchasers of palm oil. They're getting some pressure, but they're not really budging yet on the issue. And then I just found it interesting because we just had our Girl Scout season, I guess, and I ended up with an email about this. There's some Girl Scouts here in the United States a few years ago that realized their Girl Scout cookies are, most of them have palm oil in them, and it's not being sustainably produced. And these 10 or 11-year-old girls got concerned about that and started a campaign to switch, and Girl Scouts has not made that switch yet, but interestingly, the Girl Guides, a similar group in the United Kingdom, has made the switch, and they've substituted and are, I think, not using, I don't know if they've switched to sustainably, I say that they have. Anyway, they've made a switch in the positive, whether it's they've substituted the ingredient or they've gone to sustainably, but in the UK, they've recognized it as an issue to be addressed. And some reading I've done about it too says it doesn't necessarily recommend that we boycott palm oil, because unless we totally change our diets, palm oil is, well, what is it? It's an oil that's a solid. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to use it. We're going to need something similar to that, unless we completely stop eating Girl Scout cookies, for example. So what they're really recommending is not that we boycott it, but that we go to this route where we're really making sure it's sustainably produced. It is an income for people. It is a way to bring industry, but if it's done in the right way. So in other signs of hope, in October 2010, the Body Shop did cut ties with Gabon. I think it's also just important to notice an international campaign that had results. And in April 4, just this last month, the Las Pavas community returned to their land, and here they are with their flag walking back to their land. And then in May 2011, just last week, Colombia's highest court did rule that the land belongs to the Las Pavas community. So that this has been in the Colombian courts for years, and the Las Pavas people have had a lot of disappointment in court in terms of showing that this land was actually their land. And so
there's a lot of opportunities in the Colombian courts for people with a lot of money and power to have influence and kind of get the results that they want. So this is a big victory for them. So just talking real quickly about some of the things that we can do to have an impact on Colombia. If you want to learn more about some of the issues affecting Colombia, one good resource is the Facts blog that's published by the Latin American Working Group, the Washington Office on Latin America, and the Center for International Policy. It really focuses on military intervention in Latin America with a lot of information about Colombia. Adam Isaacson, who's one of their main editors, has been working in Colombia issues for years and knows a lot about these issues and really focuses on that. Christian Peacemaker Teams, the organization that we work with doing accompaniment, has a website where you can read about the Colombia Project in Colombia. Also, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, the organization that sponsored Don when he went to Colombia, has a website with information about their work in Colombia. So those are some places you can look for information about what's going on in Colombia. Also encourage you to go to Colombia, and if you haven't already been, it is a beautiful country. The people are very welcoming, very friendly. Encourage you to go and learn more firsthand about what life is like there. Christian Peacemaker Teams and Witness for Peace and other organizations do delegations, usually a 1 or 2 week trip to Colombia where you will go meet with human rights organizers, community organizations, have people give you some background on the conflict, some background on what's happening in Colombia right now, and then you'll actually get to meet with some of these people who are doing the work right in their communities. And then advocate for Colombia here at home. Encourage Congress and the President to send less military aid and more development aid. Shift that balance. It's shifted a little bit in recent years, but it's still mostly military aid that we're sending. And the people that we've talked to in Colombia say more weapons are not going to lead to less war. And so I think they're very clear on that, and I think we need to be very clear on that too, that development is what the country needs, not weapons.